welcome back after what was hopefully a good lunch break. I know that some of you at least managed to enjoy the sunshine. My name's Gabrielle again, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third panel of the day, which focuses on African security and climate change. Unfortunately, Vivian Loom, who is listed on the program, is not able to join us in person or virtually today, so we'll have a smaller than anticipated panel, which gives each of the speakers a couple of minutes more to share their presentations, and will provide for an extended question and answer period, which is, something to look forward to. And so we'll proceed in the order that's on the program. I'll introduce each of the speakers prior to their presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end after each of the three speakers has had the chance to present. So we'll begin on, well, I guess everybody's on my left, my immediate left. Dr. Noah Manuela Garcia Nyangono holds a degree in political science with a major in international relations from the University of Yaoundé. He holds a PhD in governance and regional integration from the Pan-African University, where his PhD dissertation examined the Pan-African environmental security architecture. Between June and August 2024, he was a visiting researcher at the Raoul Dandurand Chair at Nkem, where he is currently a PhD fellow. He's also an associate researcher at the Centre de Recherche et d'Études Politiques et Stratégiques at the University of Yaoundé, and has published numerous articles on climate diplomacy and environmental protection in peacekeeping operations. So I'll turn it over to you.
Bonjour à tous. Merci Gabrielle pour cette présentation. Avant de commencer mon exposé, je voudrais d'abord dire le plaisir qui est le mien de prendre part à ce banquet scientifique qui permet non seulement d'enrichir la connaissance dans le domaine du climat et de la sécurité, mais également de partager les résultats de mes recherches sur la question. Alors, la présentation que je m'en vais faire aujourd'hui s'intitule « L'insécurité climatique, un défi humanitaire majeur pour le Cameroun. Quelle stratégie pour l'avenir ?» Alors, en guise de mise en contexte, nous allons d'abord dire que le Cameroun a depuis longtemps reconnu l'environnement et plus précisément le climat comme une question d'intérêt public et a donc à cet effet initié un ensemble de réformes institutionnelles qui ont mené à la mise sur pied de plusieurs organes consultatifs, des organes scientifiques, politiques et techniques de lutte contre le changement climatique, au nombre desquels l'Observatoire national sur les changements climatiques, mais également adopter un plan d'action, un plan national d'adaptation, a mis sur pied un observatoire national des risques qui, même s'ils adressent la question des risques de manière globale, mettent de plus en plus une emphase sur les risques liés au climat. Alors, parmi ces organes, on a l'Observatoire national des changements climatiques qui produit régulièrement des alertes climatiques au niveau du Cameroun et ces alertes font de manière de plus en plus récurrente d'une évidence dans l'augmentation de la quantité de pluie tombée, notamment plus de 800 mm de plus que la moyenne. Et généralement, ces pluies diluviennes alternent avec des sécheresses, des tempêtes et sont bien évidemment amplifiées par des variations de température. Alors, ceci s'est produit ou s'est ressenti concrètement par des événements ou des catastrophes de plus en plus récurrentes. En 2012, nous avons eu des inondations avec des dizaines de morts, particulièrement dans la partie septentrionale du pays, l'extrême nord, dans les régions de Yagua et de Maga particulièrement. En octobre 2020, nous avons eu également des inondations qui ont causé environ 160 000 sinistrés et 64 morts. En 2023, à Yaoundé, la capitale, nous avons eu des inondations qui ont causé des dégâts matériels important aussi, avec des dizaines de morts. Et plus récemment, en octobre 2024, suite à 60 jours de pluie consécutifs, ce qui n'avait jamais été observé auparavant, le ministère de l'administration territoriale camerounais a identifié environ 459 000 sinistrés, 56 034 maisons détruites, 82 509 hectares de cultures détruits, 5 262 têtes de bétail perdues et des dégâts estimés à plusieurs millions milliards de francs CFA, ce qui renseigne bien évidemment sur la gravité de l'insécurité ou alors des effets liés à l'insécurité climatique dans le pays. Et à côté de ça, il faut relever aussi que la situation humanitaire n'est pas la meilleure qu'on le dirait. Des derniers rapports du Bureau de coordination des affaires humanitaires de janvier et d'avril 2025 font état d'environ 1,5 million de personnes en précarité humanitaire, en situation de précarité humanitaire directement liée au conflit, parmi lesquels 431 000 réfugiés qui sont en réalité dû à la guerre avec Boko Haram, mais de manière plus globale à l'instabilité qui caractérise la région du lac Tchad. Nous avons également environ 1,1 million de personnes déplacées internes. Et, voilà. Et tout ceci est bien évidemment amplifié par une grande prévalence des groupes armés non étatiques, particulièrement dans l'extrême nord, et le bassin du lac Tchad, la crise anglophone et qui sévit à l'ouest du pays et la crise politique en RCA. Pour l'énoncé de notre question de recherche, nous avons conceptualisé l'insécurité climatique à partir d'une approche subjective en tant que représentation sociale, c'est-à-dire un sentiment, une angoisse qui est partagée au sein des individus d'être victimes de plus en plus de phénomènes climatiques, mais également dans une approche, on dirait, un peu plus objective, en conceptualisant l'insécurité climatique comme un vecteur de menace, comme un démultiplicateur d'instabilité et un facteur aggravant des conflits. Et l'action humanitaire ici a été pensée dans le sens d'une nécessité sociale, d'un devoir moral et un impératif politique qu'ont non seulement l'État camerounais vis-à-vis des personnes en situation de précarité humanitaire, mais dans une perspective de solidarité globale, les partenaires internationaux, les organisations non gouvernementales, en ce qui concerne l'assistance aux personnes en situation de détresse. Alors, le lien entre insécurité climatique et action humanitaire se construit autour des situations, des risques et d'urgence que l'insécurité climatique pose non seulement à l'État, mais également aux individus de manière plus précise. Il faut dire aussi que dans le cadre de ce travail, on aurait pu aborder aussi la question de l'insécurité climatique comme une menace à la conduite des actions humanitaires, notamment dans l'extrême nord encore, où non seulement la menace est plus présente, mais où le besoin humanitaire est le plus pressant. Et on va observer que là, lorsqu'il y a par exemple des inondations, des conflits entre communautés et des migrations intranationales et internationales, cela accroît bien évidemment non seulement une pression sur les ressources dont dépendent les communautés, mais cela réduit aussi la capacité de l'État non seulement à prendre en charge les populations qui sont déjà en situation de précarité humanitaire, mais également de prendre en charge celles qui viennent s'ajouter à cela. Donc, de manière globale, le nombre de personnes en situation de précarité aujourd'hui au Cameroun, lorsqu'on combine aussi bien la précarité liée au conflit armé, mais également celle liée à l'insécurité climatique ou environnementale, s'élève à environ 2 100 000 personnes, ce qui constitue un peu plus de 6 à 7% de la population totale du pays. Alors, la question de cette recherche a été construite autour de comment l'insécurité climatique rencontre le champ de l'action humanitaire, quels sont les défis que cette insécurité pose et comment y répondre. Alors, pour traiter la question, nous avons mené un certain nombre d'actions en termes de collecte des données. Nous avons mené des entretiens principalement au ministère de l'administration territoriale du Cameroun, la direction de la protection civile, qui organise un peu la réponse de sécurité civile que l'État met en œuvre en ce qui concerne l'atténuation ou alors la réponse aux catastrophes, qu'elles soient naturelles ou climatiques. Nous avons également mené des entretiens au niveau de la Croix-Rouge camerounaise, du Corps national des sapeurs-pompiers et au ministère de l'Environnement, de la protection de la nature et du développement durable. Nous avons également utilisé un certain nombre d'instruments, notamment le plan ORSEC, Organisation de la réponse de sécurité civile au niveau du Cameroun, le plan national de contingence et plus récemment la loi de 2024 portant protection civile au Cameroun qui réactualise la doctrine camerounaise en termes de protection civile en intégrant à l'intérieur non seulement les risques technologiques, les risques naturels, qui étaient initialement les risques autour desquels était construite cette stratégie, mais en intégrant aussi dorénavant les risques environnementaux et plus particulièrement climatiques. Alors, en termes de résultats, il apparaît clair au terme de notre étude que l'insécurité climatique accroît la précarité humanitaire au Cameroun et est vecteur des menaces, facteur de violence. Alors, les menaces dont il s'agit ici, c'est principalement des menaces à la santé, et particulièrement à travers la dissémination des maladies hydriques, plus particulièrement le choléra, du fait non seulement des inondations, mais également de la sécheresse, parce qu'il faut savoir qu'en période de sécheresse, particulièrement dans l'extrême nord, parce que c'est vraiment la région la plus touchée et la plus vulnérable, la raréfaction des points d'eau fait en sorte que les humains et les animaux partagent des points d'eau communs qui sont parfois utilisés aussi bien pour l'alimentation, pour l'accès à l'eau potable, que pour l'alimentation du bétail. Alors, depuis 2021, on a recensé officiellement plus de 5000 cas de choléra. En 2023, particulièrement, on a eu 88 cas et 5 décès à Yaoundé à la suite, bien évidemment, des pluies diluviennes qui se sont accompagnées d'un certain nombre d'inondations. Et plus récemment, 127 cas de choléra et 2 décès. Ça, ce sont des chiffres, bien évidemment, officiels. Et voilà, mais nous pensons objectivement que si l'analyse est plus poussée, ces chiffres peuvent être bien en deçà. Les chiffres qui sont présentés par l'État camerounais peuvent être bien en deçà de la réalité opérationnelle. Alors, l'insécurité climatique est aussi, en quelque sorte, mène aussi à l'insécurité alimentaire. Parce que lorsque vous avez plus de 82 000 hectares de cultures détruits, il apparaît clair que les populations qui dépendent directement de ces cultures-là se retrouvent en situation de précarité alimentaire chronique. 82 000 hectares de cultures détruites, 66 000 tonnes de céréales. Lorsqu'on sait que l'alimentation de base des populations dans cet espace, mais de manière plus globale au Cameroun, se fonde essentiellement sur ces céréales de base, notamment le riz, le sorgho, le mil, le maïs. Et l'UNICEF fait état actuellement d'environ 4 000 enfants en situation de malnutrition aiguë sévère, uniquement dans l'extrême nord. Ça sont les chiffres des Nations Unies. Et l'autre type d'insécurité à laquelle le changement climatique ou l'insécurité climatique mène, c'est l'insécurité foncière et les conflits. Parce que l'insécurité climatique ici ne s'entend pas seulement au sens d'une croissance des précipitations, mais également en termes d'aridification des sols qui conduisent bien évidemment à des conflits agropastoraux. Et je voudrais préciser ici que lors d'une enquête de terrain que j'ai menée en 2013, dans le cadre de mon master de recherche, j'avais fait une descente de terrain à l'extrême nord du Cameroun. Et à ce moment, il existait déjà des dynamiques migratoires infranationales et internationales du Tchad vers le Cameroun, des populations qui, face à la ridification de leurs terres, étaient obligées de migrer plus au sud, soit pour trouver des terres arables, soit pour travailler pour des propriétaires terriens et ainsi obtenir une rétribution. Mais à un moment donné, ces migrations devenaient un peu plus compliquées pour ces populations compte tenu du manque de moyens, et ça conduisait quelquefois à des clashs autour de l'appropriation des terres. Alors, pour aller rapidement, à ce jour, il y a le cadre harmonisé d'identification des zones à risque du ministère de l'Agriculture et du Développement rural qui, sur la base de ces données, fait état de 3,5 millions de personnes menacées d'insécurité humanitaire, d'insécurité alimentaire sévère en 2024. Alors, l'autre résultat, c'est que l'insécurité humanitaire réduit les capacités opérationnelles des acteurs humanitaires. Parce que lorsqu'il y a des inondations et que la digue de Maga se brise, les acteurs humanitaires ne peuvent plus se déplacer de manière optimale sur le terrain parce que les inondations parfois détruisent les routes qui sont pour la plupart en terre et accroissent bien évidemment les moyens qui doivent être déployés. Alors, face à tout ceci, l'État camerounais a mis sur pied un ensemble d'éléments stratégiques de réponse parmi lesquels la loi de 2024 à laquelle j'ai fait allusion tout à l'heure, qui préconise une mise en œuvre coordonnée par les différents intervenants, bien évidemment, de la réponse en cas de crise ou de catastrophe humanitaire. Ceci dans l'optique, bien évidemment, d'optimiser l'efficacité de l'action et obtenir des résultats durables. Et au niveau de du ministère de l'administration civile, il existe une direction de la protection civile qui est chargée de la coordination des moyens de protection civile, notamment en ce qui concerne le secours, le sauvetage, la coordination logistique, l'utilisation des forces supplétives et auxiliaires. Donc, parmi ces forces supplétives et auxiliaires, il y a le Corps national des sapeurs-pompiers, mais également le génie civil camerounais et des unités spéciales de l'armée camerounaise qui, dans le cadre d'une réforme initiée en 2001 de son armée, a mené à l'introduction par le Cameroun de la question environnementale dans sa stratégie militaire dans le cadre de l'action de l'État en mer. Alors, cette action aujourd'hui prend plus la forme d'une lutte contre la biopiraterie et dans l'optique de la préservation de la biodiversité, notamment dans le cadre du Golfe de Guinée, mais également une dimension beaucoup plus climatique avec le génie civil qui quand même a participé depuis ces dernières années à une opération de reboisement dans l'extrême nord du Cameroun qui a conduit qui les a amenés à replanter environ 100 000 arbres pour limiter l'action ou les effets du changement climatique. Alors, il existe donc un ensemble d'éléments stratégiques de réponse qui ont été mis sur pied, les plans ORSEC, le plan blanc, le Corps national des sapeurs-pompiers, qui, comme je le disais, est un acteur opérationnel qui intervient non seulement dans la lutte contre les catastrophes technologiques, mais intervient également de plus en plus dans la lutte contre les catastrophes climatiques. Alors, en termes de recommandations, nous préconisons l'autonomisation et l'éclatement de la direction de la protection civile. Nous préconisons l'autonomisation et l'éclatement de la direction de la protection civile qui va permettre bien évidemment une institutionnalisation d'une structure en charge des risques et catastrophes climatiques. Nous préconisons également la mise en place de cellules de veille régionales qui, dès lors que les alertes sont produites, vont sensibiliser les populations et initier au niveau... comment le dire, et initier auprès de ces populations-là, bien évidemment, des actions de résilience et d'adaptation. Nous préconisons aussi l'investissement dans l'aménagement d'infrastructures de drainage d'eau et de digues, l'assainissement urbain. Pourquoi? Parce que lorsque le fleuve Lagrange, par exemple, sort de son lit et inonde toute la région de Yagua, de Maga, brise la digue de Magua, cela empiète évidemment sur le déploiement de l'État, sur le déploiement des acteurs humanitaires, mais également réduit les capacités d'adaptation et même de résilience des populations. Alors, c'est de manière vraiment très rapide ce que nous pouvions dire à propos de notre présentation. Je vous remercie pour votre attention et c'est avec plaisir que je prendrai des questions. Merci.
Merci. So next we have Gabriel Lagrange, who is a junior researcher specializing in climate security, international governance, and geopolitics based in Geneva. He is the director of the Environmental Geopolitics Department at the Institut for Applied Geopolitics, a Paris-based think tank, and has experience working with UN organizations such as the IOM and UNEP, and with international think tanks such as the International Crisis Group. Gabriel holds a Master in International Relations from Sciences Po Bordeaux with a thesis on the UN Security Council's role in environmental protection during armed conflict. This work was published in the Journal for Social Encounter in 2024, and he has also published other research products, including a report on climate security at COP. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm really glad to be here. It's also my first time in Canada, so really glad to be in Montreal and Canada for the first time. First, I would like to thank the organizers for an amazing conference, and same for the previous panelists and previous chair. Thank you so much as well, Gabriel, for being our chair, and for also my stellar panelists. Maybe to take a step back, indeed, I'm the director of the Institute for Applied Geopolitics Department on the geopolitics of the environment. We are a French think tank based in Paris and specialize in international affairs and everything linked to geopolitics, really. And we provide services, articles, and analytical, more generally thinking, as well as capacity building. And within our work, we also collaborate with the French Ministry of Defense and the International Division for a strategic atlas around French interests and strategic interests. And in this framework, I have published the article I'll be presenting on Niger's coup, climate security, and the failure of Western intervention. So, as you may know, on July 2023, Niger's military ousted the ex-president Bazoum, for a very set of reasons that can be framed around military decolonization, and more particularly around three sets of criteria and values. The first one is the perceived rise of insecurity due to terrorist threats. So we heard already about how dangerous the Lake Chad can be, and the same on basically the other borders with Mali and Burkina. The second argument is around a socioeconomic crisis that Niger has known for quite a long time. And the third one is bad governance. But in addition to these criteria, one important thing to keep in mind, and that will be unfolding around the whole presentation, is the rise of nationalism with the military coup. And I think it's quite the same with every military coup in every state we can know, for in Myanmar, in other states such as Mali, Burkina. And as well as nationalism is the importance of sovereignty in the speech and the discourses. And in Niger, it's basically targeted to France and to the French post-colonialism, because Niger is a colony of France. And so, even though the coup, it was quite a bit of a surprise, no one has saw once a warning sign about the coup compared to what we saw in Mali and Burkina again, but it has. There was a lot of international backlash, international reaction from a regional perspective from the African Union, from ECOWAS, which is the regional cooperation organization in West Africa, but also from Western allies and partners, especially France. And the main reason around that is because the Niger's coup represents the third, among many others, coup in the region, and countries or organizations wanted to make a stop of this trend. And especially for France, Niger was the last ally in the Sahel, ally for migration, ally for natural resources, ally for security. And so the breakdown, the military represents a breakdown of all of these alliances. That is called in French, France-Afrique, that we may have already heard, which is basically the long-standing economic and political relationship between the two countries, but mostly in every Africa when concerning France, ex-colonies, that was once perceived and built to be a stabilization factor, but today is viewed as neo-colonial, and it fuels local resentment. Also, another factor that is not on the slide is the geopolitical shift, because we saw a withdrawal of Western countries compared to the rise of non-Western countries such as Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, among others. And so when you look at all the things I've just said, you might be wondering, okay, so we are on the climate conference, what the hell is he talking about? And so this is the main point of my articles. Basically, what we heard is about security, it's about economy, but climate there is missing. Despite Niger being one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, when you look at the ND gain index, I think Niger is 176th country in the ranking, so it's quite low, quite vulnerable, with not a lot of adaptation capacity. Because it's affected by disrupted seasons, by droughts, by floods. And so, as an example, the floods in 2024, 1.5 million people were affected by the floods, which is quite an important total, and 400 people died because of the floods. But more than just climate and climatic examples, 2.5 million people are food insecure in Niger as in early 2025, and by the next century, 80% of Niger's GDP could slash because of the agricultural dependency, because agriculture is really reliant on climate, on rainfall, and with climate impacts, then we might have a lot of additional economic impacts. But more than just a climate and a food crisis, well, we've heard numerous times already today that climate can be a threat multiplier, so I will not try to be a bit not too long on this part, but basically Niger is facing a lot of climate security issues. The first one being the increased competition between farmers and herders, so the intercommunal conflict that we all know already about, because pastoralists go south, and with the disrupted seasons, there's an increased competition for resources, whether water, whether grazing lands. But I don't want to be too much climate determinist. I think Dominic, in his slide, said that we have to be aware of climate determinism, and it's the same in Niger because there's a lot of human factor, there's a lot of political factors. The first one being the agricultural expansion driven by population growth, which encroach transhumance corridors, which is another factor of the conflict. And the third factor is the public policies, because in Niger there's a historical belief that pastoralists are criminals, and so public policies are trying to sedentarize pastoralists to make them farmers, for example, or rather to have sedentary herders. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, because it means there's legal rifts between legal frameworks and what's going on the ground. And so it's sort of combination of climate, socioeconomic and political factors that are at the heart of the crisis. It's not only climate, it's really more than that. And this is where intervention should be framing and targeting. And I wanted to also emphasize that this conflict and this crisis are common in the Sahel, unfortunately. We had example of the Lake Chad, but as a figure maybe, in the Sahel since 2020, we see a surge of 140% of natural resources events. So it's really, really important, and the figures were quite already important before. And the death related to these conflicts doubled since 2020. So that's really important to remember. And a final thing on climate security is that all these conflicts around farmers and herders are also exploited by armed groups, because they're exploiting the climate vulnerability on one hand and the ethnic, or at least the intercommunal division. And so this is something, again, important to remember, because afterwards they use it as a recruitment factor, because people are joining armed groups not for religious belief, but rather because they want to be protected, because they seek revenge, or for seeking economic livelihood alternatives. And armed groups in Niger impose a sort of new, at least alternative governance. For example, they can provide services such as water, cattle protection. They can also create natural resources management framework and provide environmental regulations such as logging bans. But it does not mean it's fairly peaceful in non-state armed groups territories. I guess it's obviously linked to violence and coercion. So a few examples can be the destruction or poisoning of water points. It can be cattle attacks or food stock attacks. And so just to say, this governance framework that the armed groups are trying to create are quite ad hoc and opportunistic. It's not just to say they're not planning to be climate actors, not at all. They just want to do that so they can win the heart of the communities. But all of these issues that are, I believe, quite important and at the heart of Niger crisis, insecurity, as well as socioeconomic crisis, are not represented, for example, from a French perspective, but it's a bit the same for a Western perspective. Because since the 60s for France, security and economic interests were at the heart of the responses and the intervention. And still today, France's intervention in the Sahel remains quite military focused and responding to the symptoms, so the consequences of the crisis, rather than the root causes of the crisis. So in other words, they're trying just to track terrorist groups rather than addressing socioeconomic crisis, climate crisis, governance crisis, etc. And I believe that's one of the reasons why just a month following the arrival of the junta at the head of Niger, defense agreements were revoked from France, but the same way, for example, with the US in 2024, which represents as well another fail-off, another tactic which was a bit more pragmatical. But still, this withdrawal signifies a growing distrust towards French military, which can be analyzed under two angles. The first one is because it's basically ineffective, because the results was probably bits of punctual successes, such as killing and targeting of, let's say, terrorist leaders. But when you compare with the growing terrorist and attacks, there's quite an imbalance there. And the other factor is that it was accused of being the continuity of colonial legacy, of unequal power relationship. And at the end of the day, even though it was presented and conceived as being a stabilization, French Western intervention was conceived, or at least understood by the population as having a double agenda, because they want to rather protect France's interests rather than protecting the population, for instance. And I believe this is because there's a huge neglect of the underlying causes of the conflicts, of the insecurity in Niger, because they focus on counterterrorism rather than, for example, solving, or at least trying to contribute to climate action. But I don't want to put too much, not say pressure, but too much emphasis as well on France, but also to understand what the junta has done, because it's on both sides, right? And so basically they did not respond to the issue at the heart of the coup. So if you remember, as said, they arrived, or they criticized the insecurity, and the figures, for example, from Activités show us that there is a rise of intensification of attacks, as well as a spread, geographical spread, that even are going into coastal states. And so there's now a spread of Sahelian dynamics into the Gulf of Guinea dynamics, for example. That's one factor. The other one is the governance and corruption, because we see since the junta has arrived into power, a sort of militarization of public policy, and now military spending are quite opaque due to a new decree. There's also now military actors are awarded with resource plunder. So it means that natural resources are now used as a financial gain, but within the administration. So I think that's really an important dynamic to take into account. And the first thing is the economic collapse, because in 2025, for the first time in Niger history, more than half the population is under the poverty line. So basically just to say that the junta did not respond to any of the challenges that helped them being held the power. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is the potential backlash of the focus on the nationalist discourse, because even though it can be quite powerful on the short term, on the longer term it can have severe consequences for the junta itself, notably because it has isolated Niger from the international community, especially funding. The national budget was reduced, was divided by 2 in 2024 because of the Western withdrawal of Niger, which led to a deprioritization of climate action compared to security and counterterrorism. So that has to be remembered. And also, the resurgence of neocolonial patterns with new allies, so with Russia and China, I think that's a factor that's, from Western perspective, we can build on. And more generally, I'd like to say that the focus on nationalism, I think, masks a lack of coherent long-term strategy that climate security, or let's say climate resilience, can support, both from the junta perspective, but also for the French perspective. So I'd like to end my intervention on the pathway for engagement. So basically we heard on the previous panel how environmental peace building can be an entry point for action, and I'd say climate resilience as well, because it's embedded into environmental peace building. So for example, for the junta is to prioritize again climate resilience, because it can, on one hand, fight against climate crisis, but so you can have climate action, but at the same time, on the longer term, fights insecurity. So it can be through climate resilient projects. So you can, there are a lot of them. So on water management, on pasture, on agricultural productivity. So you can name it really, but they need to be conflict sensitive as well. There's project to be climate sensitive and conflict sensitive at the same time is really important. So you make sure that the project do not do any harm. The second thing I think is supports pastoral mediation, because if I was clear, I hope pastoral conflict between farmers and herders can lead to terrorism. So the aim here is to say that if you have less conflicts over natural resources, then it can lead to reduce terrorism on the longer term. The third aspect is to rethink counterterrorism strategy by including a more climate-sensitive lens. And the fourth recommendation for the junta is to regain the leverage that it has with the ex-president Bazoum on climate security, especially at the UN Security Council with the 2021 resolution, the failed resolution due to China and Russia. So that's for the junta. And for the Western allies, I guess climate resilience and climate security also represent a lot of opportunities but it has to be said that potentially there will be no immediate collaboration because of the political harsh time, but climate resilience acts as an apolitical, technical, neutral, and potentially an alternative to what Russia and China can provide to Niger. But if considering that, it needs to have a change in approach, so same climate and conflict sensitive, and also in how we understand military intervention with more capacity building, skills sharing, etc. Notably fostering military and civil synergies. And I think we have an excellent example with UNMISS on how we can include the protection of civilians as well within the mandates. So I don't want to spoil any of that. And finally, and I will conclude on that, and from a Western perspective, and especially from France, we need to leave the paternalist approach, which is to say that France can decide for Africa's sake. It's not. We're not in the 60s anymore. And so we need to focus on useful partnerships for both countries, or for both regions at least, and not to go for influence-driven agendas. Thank you so much for your attention.
Merci, Gabriel. And third, we have Johnson Nkem, who is a senior climate security advisor at the United Nations mission in South Sudan. He has held different positions with other UN agencies, including the UN Development Programme, UN Economic Commission for Africa, and UN Women. His research experience includes working with the Center for International Forestry Research in Indonesia, Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University, and the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. He's been involved with the IPCC as coordinating lead author for a special report on climate change and land, and as a lead author for the 5th assessment report. He holds a PhD in natural resource management from Australia. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Gabrielle, and also let me take the opportunities to thank the organizers for inviting us to share our experience. It's really a privilege for me to be here and to share some of the issues we are doing in UNMISS in South Sudan, which is an active conflict in terms of what we are talking about. Just before I go into the outline, let me give you a bit of context. What is UNMISS? UNMISS is the United Nations mission in South Sudan, which is a peacekeeping mission with about 16,000 troops from 21 troop-contributing countries, including Canada. That's quite a large number of military in one location or in one country, trying to stabilize the country. Secondly, we are guided by the mandate of the Security Council, which tells us what we must do because we have to report regularly on that mandate. And interestingly, we are one of the first missions where the Security Council has specifically asked us to report about how climate change is impacting peace and security in South Sudan, and what are we doing about it. So we provide to the Secretary General every quarter a report to the Security Council on what we are doing. That's very important. And lastly, there are different types of conflict. And just to highlight that the conflict in South Sudan is a subnational conflict. And there are two broad areas. One is armed conflict, and the other one is intercommunal conflict. There again, we will listen to quite a lot of the issues which Gabriel mentioned, because if you don't look at the drivers of intercommunal conflict, the ability to achieve protection of civilians or to address those root causes become quite difficult. So my outline is simply in 5 simple parts. First, I should tell you about what is the climate in South Sudan, because that's the entry point of some of these discussions. The consequences of climate shocks, which are two primarily, disruption and displacement, because that's where the whole element of conflict starts. The last IPCC report actually picked on those two keywords, disruption and displacement. And if we don't pay attention to that, it will become more chaotic as we go forward. Then the effects of the climate change on the protection of civilians. Again, I will highlight what it is and the implementation of the climate peace and security in the mandate of the protection of civilians as an example using the flood. And then what are the way forward we intend to do in dealing with some of these issues. So let me start. The goal is generally just to highlight some of those compounding effects of climate change on the protection of civilians and also on the core mandates of UNMISS, as well as how are we responding to some of those issues as I indicated. So let's start with climate. The first is that the climate of South Sudan has changed significantly from the post-industrial period. Temperatures have increased by about 1 to 1.5 degrees. That may sound small, but that's big because South Sudan, like most African countries, falls in the tropical region where temperature is already around 23 degrees centigrade. So a 1 degree increase is quite significant on how you function. And if there is humidity, it makes it even worse for people to function. Then there is large interannual variability in terms of rainfall. Sometimes it varies over 50%. That makes planning very difficult, especially for a community that is a land-based livelihood system, where people depend on land for everything they do. Then the rainfall has become very erratic. You don't know when it will fall and what amount will it fall. And drought, on the other hand, is taking over a great part of the country. Then I deliberately skipped the future, what the future holds for South Sudan when it comes to temperature. I went straight to the seasonal forecast because this is what we use in planning. In planning any kind of climate security response. These are things that happen in very short-term series. So what we do is that we look at what is the forecast for South Sudan for a quarter. Like this one is April to June. If you see the green, it tells you that most of South Sudan will have very heavy rainfall. Heavy, and that means above normal. Above normal rainfall, what is it? We try to look at what that means. It means that you are having over 40% increase in the amount of rainfall. That's quite significant. And those who follow flooding, this will generate pluvial flooding from rainfall, which makes it even quite challenging. Then we are also keeping track of what is happening in the Horn of Africa. Why the Horn of Africa? It's not because South Sudan is there, but whatever happens in the Horn of Africa, ex-situ vulnerability, whatever happens in the Horn of Africa affects South Sudan because South Sudan is at the confluence of so many rivers, like the Nile. Lake Victoria is part of this. So whatever amount of increased rainfall that occurs there flows to South Sudan, which is at the floodplain of all of these systems. So the tendency is that if you don't track what is happening at the regional level, you miss the ability to see the implications of climate change in that region, and particularly the security implication. So we keep track of this, and as you see again, even the Horn of Africa will have, in most part, above normal rainfall. Last year, only Lake Victoria had to release 2,600 cubic liters of water per second because of the terrible increase in the lake level. And most of that water flowed to South Sudan. So it's something we really pay attention to. This is, again, temperature. I mean, the level of heat waves is becoming quite rampant. Schools are closed because of some of these events. And we know that most of the activities are outdoor activities. So the tendency of heat waves really creating massive disruption is very high, especially for livestock farmers who have to move their livestock to places. So now let's go, how does this the consequences of this disruption is expressed? Again, as I was saying, it's all based on contrasting a hydrological expression. One part of the country is facing massive drought, another part is facing drought. Sometimes it's back to back or concurrently. So it stretches the system very, very much. When it happens, this is some of the issues to face. There's total crop failure, whether it's drought or whether it's flood. So this is really the scale of disruption that pushes people completely into humanitarian needs immediately. This is a case that, these are cases I took myself when you see how farmlands and even pasture are completely inundated and over a prolonged period of time, which creates the tendency for people to move involuntarily in most of these cases. This is how women get to go out desperately to look for firewood to cook. And this tendency tends to increase the level of kidnapping, conflict-related sexual violence, and a lot of practices which are unbelievable under this kind of conflict and climate shock situation. Again, even for livestock herders, it's quite dramatic because they lost a lot of cattle. I mean, in 2022, it was more than 1 million cattle that was lost in South Sudan from flooding. This year, we are still computing how much got lost. But then, when you see the level of struggle, this herder is trying to move his livestock on the other side, it becomes lawless in terms of it weaponizes the practice. In other words, he's not ready for any negotiation for whoever wants to stop him from moving because he has gone through hell to get that livestock to the other side. It's not only livestock, it's also wildlife. South Sudan has the biggest mammal migration in the world, more than 5 million antelopes. We don't know about it because of the conflict, but they also migrate and they become either victim of armed conflict or sometimes utilized to make money for some of this kind of terrible situation that we find. So now let's go, how are we protecting civilians in UNMISS? There are 3 broad areas when we talk about protection of civilians. One, the shock of climate change expands the need for protection. I've shown some of that there. People become desperate, they need food, or they are displaced from where they live. The second one is the ability itself for peacekeepers to provide protection. It becomes very bad. Then the third one is seasonal patterns in the occurrence and intensity of the conflict. We've noticed that a lot of the conflict occurs in the dry season, a lot of fighting. People actually postpone fighting to fight in the dry season when the terrain is good. So it stretches the peacekeeping mission so much. We plan for it, but it's really a very tough time for everybody because as a subnational conflict is spread out so that it makes it very difficult to try to put your finger around it. So now let's see, these are some of these situations which we face. Again, I've said it before, South Sudan, the shock of climate has been quite intense and recurrent. Part of that is due to the Niño. We've experienced cases where in 2023, over 2.3 million people were displaced, and the food security classification is becoming even more dire, right? More than 46% of the population are experiencing high level of acute food insecurity, which is just unbelievable. Then the conflict in Sudan has even made it worse because Sudan is just next door. We have been receiving more than 1.2 million people already coming as either returnees or like people fleeing from the conflict itself. So that puts additional pressure on the whole system on how to deal with it. Then the element of cropping, I've said before, there have been a shift in seasons such that the tendency for cropping and pastoral migration is overlapping in a way that the conflict is becoming more and more dangerous. And also because of flood, seasonal migration is no more an issue. In fact, we are now dealing with protracted migration, where flood displaces cattle herders, they go, they cannot come back when they were supposed to come. So it makes it another wave of issues because it is perceived as occupation and no more migration. So it makes people feel very sensitive and creates a lot of intercommunal issues. One of the things we do, we try to track where are the floods occurring, how many people are affected. You could see in this map itself, the big bubbles tells you where people are significantly impacted by the flood. This is just for 2023. We have that for 2024, and even with the onset of the flood season now, we are tracking for 2025. Similarly, we are tracking what is drought happening, because drought seems to become, is falling in the shadows of the flood. People are not paying attention to it, but a great part of the country is affected by drought, as you see in that figure. This is even as recent as March 2025. The extent of drought by states, you see that, and the different colors tells you how people are affected and the area affected by drought itself. Similarly, the crop extent, the amount of land that has been affected by drought, we are tracking all of that because it's causing people to move from where they are supposed to do. One of the things we try to do is say, okay, when all of these things are happening, what is the relationship between climate hotspots, conflict hotspots, and humanitarian hotspots? Because we don't have primary data to really go deep into this, but we want to see what is the knock-on effect that each have on the other to be able to see how we can respond to some of these things. So one of the things we did, and which the military, with the joint military operation does, is to map out the hotspots of conflict. You see those bubbles, and the reddish the color, the more intense what is conflict. So we map that every year, like incident heat maps, where things really occurred. Then we now say, let's superimpose that with flood, areas that were impacted by flood. You see the blue area that is emerging. Then we said, okay, how is the humanitarian landscape among these? You see the yellow. You see a lot of strong overlap in terms of how these things are happening, to show that there's no way, it's not an element of attribution, but association, right? We are not talking of either climate or whatever, but we are showing that you cannot completely decouple all of that. So these are some of the things we are doing to show that there is a prominent hotspots of conflict within the perimeter of climate shocks in a lot of the places. And also people are forced to, displaced people are forced to congregate in some places, which becomes, again, new hotspots of conflict under this. Then when we look at the 3 tiers for the protection of civilians, and how is climate change? There are 3 tiers, for those who are not familiar. One is the dialogue and engagement, to get people into really involved in part of this. Then the second tier is the provision of physical protection, which again, the military does a lot of that, and that includes humanitarian and all of this element of dealing with displaced people. And then the third one is the establishment of protective engagement, right? Rule of law and all of that kind of stuff. But you see the biggest, where climate impact is very severe is on the second tier, the protection of civilians, because there is a lot of element of coordination, providing physical protection by the military. But we also have a strong role to do with the dialogue and engagement, because where there is a historical conflict, if you don't use that, you are creating new areas of conflict to be able to deal with this issue. So this is just a picture of how one of the Bantu, those who are familiar a little bit, Bantu was completely surrounded by water, which makes it very difficult for anybody to access these places. Then this is the kind of things some of our military have to go through to try to reach people who have been isolated in some places because of this, in order to provide the kind of protection we need. So let me quickly go, before my time is wrapped up, on one key example, and that is the flood. We had the flood last year, and one of the things we did was to try to see how do we protect civilians, even under flood. One of the first things we did was to map out the high grounds. Where are people moving to flee from the floods? Communities, because of intercommunal conflict, there are already communities that have conflict between them. So if you don't map this high ground, it will be terrible. People will fight and kill themselves even more. We took our time to map out this high ground and said, okay, how do we access? We knew that the main caveat here is safeguarding access rights to this life-saving location for everybody. Otherwise, those who have conflict with another community, they will not move there. So we now look at, say, okay, how do we help the military do joint patrols, focusing on flood extent and so on? How do we get the states to be involved in flood management committees? What kind of peace dialogue can we put in place so that these people are discussing? And then all of this kind of sensitization and so on. So these are the high ground by their distribution by state. Then we are their location using elevation mapping. We showed where each of them are located, because the tendency is that some of them are still in low-lying area that they will still be flooded. So you have to evacuate those people. So we try to map out where are people in different locations. You know, the greener they are outward, the higher the elevation. So we took note of that and make sure that for each state we knew where these people are. and how can we timely get them out. We also try to map where are the livestock herders moving to. Because if they move to the same high ground with humans, the tendency is that they will strain the system and there will be conflict. So we try as much as possible to tap that. And we were lucky that the Governors Forum took place and they took recognition of all of these things which they think is very useful for their eventual mapping of the flood. So way forward, and this is the last slide, we are still doing a lot of work to improve our data analytics. We still need resources to expand some of the things we are doing. And even within Old Miss, they are trying to improve the logistical response for the military, because some of their equipment are not adapted for the emerging circumstances for peacekeeping. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think that leaves us with very, very concrete responses or efforts to address these converging crises. All right, so thank you all.